hear you. Hold your water. All right. Welcome to another session with Sitting with Dr. Lob-EZ. Won't you join me as we sprint headlong down the hall of knowledge? All right, boys and girls. Today we're going to talk about social trends of 18th century Europe. Okay? Want to start out by kind of talking about the way in which families not only arrange themselves, but kind of the importance of the family as a basic social group. Now, we've talked about during the agricultural revolution and into the beginnings of the industrial revolution, how families were an economic unit as well as a social unit. But all throughout history, there's families had a role to play in helping shape the next generation of the youngins, of the children's, and it's a very important institution, the family, because it helps educate and instill values, call it socialization, if you will, the conditioning of behavior. And so that's where we're going to begin our little journey, okay? One of the unique aspects of Western European families was something called nuclear families. And what the heck is a nuclear family, you might be asking? No, it's not them weapons that, when you split the atom and causes your family to suck the paint off your house and give your family a permanent orange afro. That is not the kind of nuclear I'm talking about. The kind of nuclear I'm talking about is families where you got a mama and a papa and all the little childrens. All right. Well, what kind of other arrangement could a family have? Well, in Eastern Europe, they had families that were oftentimes multi-generational, and so you might have the mama and the papa and all the little childrens, but you'd also have a grandma and grandpa, and perhaps you would have some cousins and uncles and aunts living with you as well. But in Western Europe, the trend was for nuclear families, all right? And what that meant is that if you was going to get married, you didn't, as a young couple, you didn't live with your parents or in-laws. You'd wait until you had enough money, your wife and yourself, your spouse and yourself, you'd wait to get married until you had enough what they call economic independence. And then once you had enough money saved up, you go ahead and get hitched. All right? And that way you can afford a little house or a cottage or something like that. So as a result of that kind of unique phenomena in Western Europe, during the 18th century, what you see in looking at the table, you can see it clearly that the men and the women, they delayed marriage, right, until they were well into their 20s, okay, and that was quite common. And if you compare it to, well, if you look, and we're talking about 18th century, so that's the 1700s, remember that, kind of similar to the ages in which people often get married here in the United States in the 21st century. Okay, so that may seem normal, but in other areas, in Eastern Europe and in other countries, or in, other continents, cultures, it's quite common to get married, 18, 19 years old for a male, and as young as 15 or 16 for the young lady. All right, but in Europe, in Western Europe, it's 27, 28 for the men, 25 to 27, somewhere in there for the women, the first time they get married. All right, so that's easy enough to understand. So let's move on. All right. So what did that look like? Well, if you, as I said, if you were waiting for economic independence, you would. It all kind of depended on what you did for a living, and so if you were kind of a peasant and you lived out on a manor, you had to wait for your daddy to die, I guess, essentially, and he'd have to kind of will his land to you, and then you could move on to his land and maybe even his cottage and kind of pursue that agricultural way of life. But societies, or the culture of Western Europe kind of dictated that they didn't want people to go ahead and get hitched until that kind of requirement was met. So, the reason behind a lot of times these couples waiting to get married was because that was just kind of the expectation of everybody. And if you had a couple who decided to get married prior to having that economic independence, it's going to put all kinds of stress and strain on the village. And because what you're going to end up having is some homeless people. All right, they got this homeless problem they got to deal with, and they don't have the financial resources or wherewithal to kind of take care of those people. And you know what they called them back then? Here's a good question. Anybody know? Anybody know what they called them people that was homeless back then? They called them paupers. 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 All right? So that kind of, like I said, it put strain and stress on the status quo of a village, and so that was something that was not exactly welcome. Okay, and so what you must understand, boys and girls, is that when you get married late in life, in a time frame when you don't live very long, when the average lifespan is around 50, and you're waiting to get married till you're almost 30, you don't have but about 20 years of wedded bliss before one of y'all kick the buckets. And since your wife would have probably half a dozen or so children's, the likelihood of the man being a widow or a widower was quite high. Okay, even though women have a tendency to live longer than men, not so in the 18th century, because every time a woman would give birth to a child, there were all sorts of risks associated with it, and women had a very high rate of dying during childbirth. So sometimes you would have a man who was, in his 30s and 40s, getting married again for the second time. And so sometimes that was the case. Okay. What we got here? Okay, so this is just talking about like what these young folk would do for money as a way to kind of save up and gain that economic independence. What would they do? Well, oftentimes the young lad would go off to the if he lived in the countryside, he might, and there was a neighboring city, he could venture out and hopefully find some kind of apprenticeship with a guild all right? And then he could learn a trade, and that apprenticeship would last several years. And by the time he had saved up enough money, he was like what they call a journeyman. And so he could reasonably expect that he could take care of his wife and children, and so he might get married. But oftentimes, young people got involved in being what they call servants, all right? Being a domestic servant. And you might think, well, there's not enough rich people around to provide all these peasants, young peasants with jobs as domestic servants. Well, that just wouldn't be the case because back then, about 1 in 10, whether you look at England or continental Europe, what they would have is sometimes about 10%. 10% of the population was involved in domestic servitude. And of that 10%, about 9 in 10 of them was women, all right, young ladies. And the other 10% would be the fellers, all right? So most of the time, that's what the women did. Now, they had other occupations that they were involved in, like seamstress, being a midwife, and those were kind of considered skilled professions. So the woman could expect to make a fairly decent wage, okay? But most of them, as pictured in this portrait or this painting right here, is a woman as a domestic servant, okay? And even though there is some kind of arrangement made, usually before the young lady would go off, the father would arrange a family that would take her in, and the expectation was that the family that was taking in this servant would provide her with room and board, okay, which means food, and then they would also pay her. And they were supposed to kind of look after her and tend to her and make sure that, from a moral standpoint, she was not going to be exposed to anything improper, and that, her Christian virtues would be upheld. But we now know that that was not the case at all. Oftentimes, these women, young ladies, would be exploited by the menfolk, whether it was the father, who in most cases was married, or his young sons. And they would sometimes have their way with the young female domestic servant. And I can imagine that many times this was not a situation or an arrangement that the woman was in compliance with, that it was kind of against her will. So they have words for that today, and if you did that, that's called rape. All right, but that was often the case, and it was an unfortunate situation because if the woman, the young lady, would get pregnant and began to show, that would bring shame and to the family, and then the wife of the household would find out about it. So to prevent that from happening, the man of the house would send her packing, would fire her, and it would be very difficult for, if you were discharged as a domestic servant from one household, to go ahead and then find employment with another family, because oftentimes those jobs were given through word of mouth, and the young lady would have to have some kind of have somebody to put a good word in for her or vouch for her. But if she shows up pregnant and she's got a child, for God's sakes, the family's going to think that this is an immoral girl because she's not married. And back then that was a big problem. They did not want young ladies being pregnant outside of wedlock. All right, so this is a unfortunate aspect of this 18th century life. Oh, goodness. All right. Oh, boy. We got to talk about premarital sex. All right, what's it say up here? It says, because the time between puberty, all right, that's, I'm sure your mom and dad probably taught you about the birds and the bees by now. I sure know that I'm not going to do that. But anyway, time between puberty and marriage could sometimes be, 10 or more years. There's a period in there, where Mother Nature kind of intervenes and creates some kind of impulse. Well, I'm not going to get into that, but anyway, there was all kinds of hanky-panky going on, if you will, between the unmarried boys and girls, and that kind of worries me. As a teacher, and I see you young folk convorting with one another, and that, we got those school dances, like at the homecoming or the backwards dance, or prom even, and I've had the great misfortune of being a chaperone at some of those dances. I tell you what, I've seen a few things that would scare most people. Because the way those, the dancing that they do, and they get their hips, their hips get to gyrating, and that's not good. Because the next thing you know, that dancing, or what do they call it today? What's that girl? I forget. Miley Cyrus. She came up with that word. It's called twerking. Yeah. You know what I say about twerking? Twerking leads to the horizontal mambo, and that's how little babies are born. And we don't want to. No, we don't want to talk about that, because that's not good, right? This is Howl Central, not Makeout Central. God's sakes! All right. So the good news is at the beginning. All right, I'm going to talk about a trend at the beginning, the first half of the 18th century, all right, out of wedlock or illegitimate births were pretty low, okay? Only about 2% of babies were born out of wedlock, so that's a pretty good indicator that society was, for the most part, stable when it comes to things like that. And what were the reasons for it? Because you get, like I said, you got these couples who like we said, they had those impulses, but they can't get married. So, and they don't have the ability to prevent pregnancies like they do in the modern age. So, what prevented them? Well, obviously they could abstain, and of course, all of the social conventions would kind of come to bear on young people and try to convince them to wait until they get married. And oftentimes that was the case. But there were other times where that didn't happen. Let's be realistic about it. But what would prevent illegitimate children from being born? Well, they call them community controls. So you got to think like, in a small town, there's a phenomena today where everybody knows your business. If you live in a small town, everybody knows your business. Okay, it's not like living out in a big city where you're kind of anonymous, but in a small town you weren't. And you might think that it's polite to not, when you see something going on over your neighbors, the polite thing is not to stand out there in the front yard and gawk and stare. Especially if, some kind of ruckus is going on. And I'm not talking about anything like, violent, but like, somebody's arguing this, that, or the other thing. The polite thing is to go inside and not pay any attention to it, because it's none of your business. But that was not the case in 18th century Europe. Everybody was in it because they're bored. They got nothing to do. They don't got the TV to watch, or the video games. They get, and half of them can't read anyway, so they can't go inside and read a book, so they need a little entertainment, so they're going to watch. and then they're going to go and tell their neighbors, and they're going to get a little coffee clutch going, and this, everybody starts gossiping and telling everybody's business, and before you know it, the whole town knows. And that's exactly how these kind of things happen. And so, the young lady and the young boy, they make a mistake, and they get together, and next thing you know, they're in the family way, and she's pregnant, and there's going to be a little Junior or a little Peter Pat of little feet going to be running around pretty soon. So what are we going to do about it? Well, they want them to wait. That's the ideal situation, because they're not economically independent. But the absolute worst thing that can happen is there be an illegitimate child being born. So you got to make it right. So you got to get married, and that was what the community or the village kind of expected. All right, because if you didn't, you shame your family. You're gonna bring down on your head the ire of the preacher or the priest and all the people, and everybody's gonna be whispering about you. So you do the right thing and you go ahead and get married. All right. Where I come from, they called that a shotgun wedding. All right. So, the father finds out his darling child is pregnant by this neighbor fella, and, they gotta get married, get hitched quickly. All right. So to prevent that child from being born illegitimately. All right. And this is kind of interesting. Oh, I forgot to highlight this. So I hope you will forgive me. But they got this word up here. It kind of sounds funny. Charivari. All right. So this was a tradition all throughout Europe where if something happened like that was kind of a scandal, somebody did something wrong, whether it be a young couple getting pregnant, or something even worse. Maybe you got a husband who's, he takes to the drink, and when he gets drunk, he starts, knocking things off the counter, and he gets tired of hitting things off the counter. And he wants to hit somebody, and so he starts whacking the kids and kicking the dog and smacking his wife, and it's a big old mess. And like I said, it's a small little town, a little village. Everybody starts whispering, "Hey, did you see what Farmer Bob did to his wife, Nellie? He knocked her teeth in." And before you know it, the town folk, they getting all worked up, and they not going to put up with it. So there's going to be justice. All right. So what they're going to do is they're going to they're going to get that guy, and they're going to, wrestle him into the town square. They're going to bushwhack him, and they're going to throw him on the back of a donkey. All right. And they're going to lead that donkey all through town, and everybody is going to come out, and they're going to yell and scream and, get their pots and pans, and they're going to bang them and sing little songs, and it's all designed to humiliate that person, for what they did, because they broke some rule, okay? And so this was designed, like I said, to humiliate them, and so this was so powerful that it was effective in kind of preventing those kinds of things from happening. And I tell you what, boy, I just think about that, being a teacher in an American high school, what that would look like if we had the charivari here at school. Like if a student got caught cheating on a test, or you see that couple, and they're over there, and they're, kissing and hugging and getting a little too close. You got to leave room, okay? Back in the day, they used to say you got to leave 8 fingers between the boys and the girls, or whomever, that are coming together. If you 8 fingers in there, nothing bad will happen. You got to leave room for the Holy Spirit, is what they used to say back in the old days when I was in school. Yep. I just wondered about it. I was thinking about that. That kind of make me giggle when I think about it. If we did that, like line the hallways and put this little donkey through there, and whatever student, that got caught fighting or that did something terrible, Put him on that donkey. And everybody's banging on pots and pans and screaming and hollering and throwing rotten tomatoes at him. That might, I don't know, that might be pretty effective. I don't know, but ACLU or somebody come down and say that we can't do that. Oh, here's a interesting painting. Okay, this is a little sidebar. What that means is, I'm gonna go in a different direction here. Go off on a little tangent. Rarely do that, but I thought this is kind of important time because we're kind of talking about immorality. Well, here's this painting. It's called the Swing by some Frenchie. I ain't even going to try to pronounce his name because I just screwed up. But it is a style of art that we see in the 18th century. It's called Rococo. All right, and Rococo comes right on the heels of the previous artistic movement. Anybody know what the name of that is? Oh, for God's sakes. Jacob, why don't you wake up? Would you? Son, you always sleeping in class. We talked about this. You're supposed to go to bed at a decent hour. I don't want, I don't want you going to those all night, what do you call those dance parties where everybody's listening to the techno, ding, 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 ding. Those things, no, son, you got to get to bed at a decent hour. You young children, you need about 8 hours, 8 hours of sleep. So getting up at 6, I don't know, but I think that's probably about 10 o'clock you should go to bed by. All right, so stay awake. It's always having this conversation. Your eyes watering. All right, so anyway, back to this. See this right here? Here's this young lady swinging. All right, swinging on swing. Okay, and it's that's kind of indicative of Rococo art. It's kind of light and frolicky. That's kind of the words, the adjectives that they use to describe this movement. All right, it's not very serious. It's lighthearted, like I said. But anyway, this is not so lighthearted, okay? Because remember, we were talking about immorality. All right, so here she is, swinging. All right, well, look back here. Here's this old feller here, swinging this young damsel. All right. So the story is behind this. This is her husband. All right, right here. All right, she's, they're enjoying a nice walk together, and they come across a swing. Come on, darling, get on the swing. Let's go for a ride. Okay, and then look at this guy over here hiding in the bushes. A little peeping time. All right. Ooh, and she's like got her leg. Look what she does. She's kicking off her shoe, and she kind of exposing a little bit of herself in there, and look at it, he's looking right up. That pervert. Well, as the story kind of, I guess, behind, every painting has a story, and this here guy and this girl are, that's his mistress, and they're involved in some improper relationship, and this feller, he don't know what's going on. All right, and she's kind of grinning at him, and she sees her little boyfriend there, and she's smiling, and she's giving him a little bit of a show, for God's sakes, and that's terrible. All right, and her poor husband, he don't know what's going on. All right, and that's a painting, for God's sake. Wow. All right, so kind of tied that in there. See how I did that? Kind of stuck that painting in there. It's called the Swing, but that's a Rococo art. Move it on. Oh, more of this. Illegitimate. Oh yeah, remember how I said only about 2% of them children were born illegitimate. That means outside of wedlock. Okay, why do they call it wedlock? That don't sound very good. Sound like you're in prison or something when you're married, like you're in jail. That's not a good word. We gotta switch that around. Make that sound a little bit more positive. Make that sound a little bit more appealing. All right, but starting in about 1750s, we see the opposite happened. Okay, a lot of babies now born out of wedlock. They call it an illegitimacy explosion. That don't sound very good. So we're seeing rates anywhere from 10 to 20%, all the way up to 30. 3 out of 10 babies born out of wedlock. So that creates all kinds of challenges for a society. especially when they don't have a safety net built in, like you have in more modern civilizations. So this is kind of a problem for these. And so what we need to do is we need to investigate. We need to find out why. All right. So the same social pressures that used to exist are no longer applicable. So why? Why aren't these young people deciding to get married? All right. I mean, I think they should wait. They should abstain until they get married. But you know, they're going to make mistakes, I guess. But why are they not getting married? All right. So there's something going on. All right. So we're talking mid 1700s. So this is where I need you to think. Okay. I need you to put your thinking cap on. Okay. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint before we go to the next slide. Like, there's something else going on. You know how I say history's all connected? It's not a bunch of isolated facts and dates. Like, if you think of it in those terms, that, you know, history's related, you might be able to answer that question. But again, I'll pose it again. The question is this: what conditions, what other forces are preventing these couples that when, you know, she gets pregnant, what's preventing them from getting married? Right? Well, are you kidding me? Y'all on your cell phone, aren't you? I can see the little lights, little blue and green, little hues of light coming from your desk. You know, I tell you every time, when I start talking, you put your cell phones away. But nope, everyone, y'all so distracted, you're always on your cell phones. That's why you can't pay attention. You got the attention span of a gnat, a little gnat. You can't, because you're all thinking, who's texting me, or who I got to get on the snap doodles or whatnot. And you know what I wish I had? I wish I could. You know, you ever go to the Chuck E. Cheese? They got that whack-a-mole. You know, you got that game, and you got this little mallet, and all of a sudden these little moles pop up, and you whack them. You get like a time limit. You got to see how many you can do. Just one day, I'd like to do that. Get all the cell phones of my students and put them on a desk. All right, and give me 10 seconds. I bet I could whack every single one of those cell phones and bust them all. That's a dream come true for me. All right. I digress. Okay. The answer is, because you're all on your cell phone, I'll go ahead and tell you. It's because economically the conditions change. Remember what we talked about with the nope, I'm not going to say we're going to say the cottage industry. Remember the cottage industry? And then the machines got too big because of the innovations, and I got to move down to the factory. And all of a sudden, now people are moving, and those jobs, because of the agricultural revolution, because of the enclosure method or the enclosure movement, a lot of those peasants lose their jobs, and you know, they become wage earners. Now, for the fortunate ones, they can work for a larger landowner, you know, as like a farmhand. But as more and more innovations come online, it's more efficient. They don't need all those farm hands, and so now you got all these workers that are landless and idle. They don't have jobs. So what they going to do? What they going to do? They could turn to a life of crime. Yes, they could do that. Yeah, they could. Yeah, they could starve. They could die, turn to a life of crime, or they can move. Yes, they move. They go to where the jobs are. And where would you go if you didn't have a job and you needed one? Well, you're not going to go out into the middle of a field where there ain't nobody, right? You're going to go where the jobs are, and they're in the cities, okay? So what you got now is these young people venturing out into the cities looking for jobs, okay? And they get their jobs, and the next thing you know, oh, how are you? Nice to meet you. You're very pretty. Would you like to go on a date with me? And the next thing you know, somebody's pregnant, all right? But they don't live in the village anymore with all those community controls, all those forces bearing down to pressure them into marriage. The young feller says, hey, I don't feel like getting married. And she's like, but darling, you said you loved me. And he said, well, yeah, but I don't want to get married. Next thing you know, he leaves, and then she's left to raise little Junior, and she's not too happy. I tell you that. Nope, I wouldn't be either. So that's the deal. All right. Some of the other things that were taking place, oh boy, prostitutions. Yep, always got to talk about that. Prostitution. Yeah, so that was the way, I guess, in which the young men, yep, they had those urges or whatnot, that they would take care of that stuff, and they go to a brothel or they go to see a prostitute. You know where they call those? Like in a town, I don't know why. I should have looked it up, but I don't really care because I don't like much talking about this topic. Makes me feel a little uncomfortable. But they call the part of town where all the prostitutes hang out, they call it the red light district. The red light district. But anyway, you know what we talked about with that little, like in the instance where there's a girl that like she's a domestic servant, and then next thing you know she gets pregnant because somebody, the family she's working for, somebody gets her pregnant. And she's got to go, she got to leave. She gets fired. She can't find another job as a domestic servant. So, what she does, she becomes a prostitute. And so, sometimes they do that, all right? And I guess, I don't know why I need to tell you all this, but they, some of them women would do that for, 8-10 years, be a prostitute. Next thing you know, they say, I've saved up enough money, and I'm going to go ahead and get married and start having children, and I guess that's just a little secret. She's not going to tell anybody because I don't think her husband much obliged, his wife was a prostitute back in the old days. I don't know. Anyway, all right. So, yep. So same-sex relationships that took place. They didn't have a word for homosexuality. That is a fairly recent term. So they had all kinds of god-awful names that they called same-sex relationships. But anyway, what's interesting is it was not, how we talk about like there's privileged classes and stuff like that, and it's not fair and equal in the way that they're seen. Yep. So same applies to same-sex relationships. So if you're, poor or working class person, and you're involved in that, you're going to be what they call a social pariah. You're going to be an outcast. But if you were wealthy or you had titles, like you were part of the aristocracy or the nobility, they didn't really much care. All right? And there's proof of that, too, because when we talked about James the First of England, right, took over, was the Stuart monarchy. He followed Queen Elizabeth, and he was the King of Scotland, and he came in and he had a bunch of male lovers, and kind of everybody knew about it, but they didn't get too, worked up about it. I guess the main thing was you got to make sure you secure an heir. So got to have a wife. As long as you have a wife and you have an heir, and if that's what you want to do on your time, okay. So, so a little hypocrite, not very consistent with their view on that. But for the most part, that's kind of considered taboo during this time period. All right, moving on. Childcare and nursing. Okay, so what we got here to say here? Okay, so at the beginning of the 18th century, schooling was, we had some schools, but for educational purposes, but it was primarily that was something for the upper class. Yeah, it didn't reach down to the common people. Education, and it didn't matter. This is actually one area that it didn't make any difference if you were rich or poor, privileged or not. Every family, every married couple that had children, they all ran almost about the same chance of percentage chance of losing a child or multiple children. Okay, and there's all kinds of stories, but like go all the way back to Henry VIII. He's King of England. He's got money and he could provide for his family, and it's not like they don't have enough food to eat. But his who was his first wife? What was her name? For God's sakes, she was Ferdinand and Isabella, Catherine of Aragon. She had about 6 kids, and about 4 or 5 of those kids died. Yeah. Could you imagine that? As a parent? One, let alone, having 6 children die. Holy cow, I can't imagine anything worse than that. But yeah, that was quite common, even during the 18th century. All right, lots of babies dying, and there's all kinds of they don't really understand what the heck they're doing. They don't. There's a big problem, and we'll get into it later. They didn't understand what was called germ theory of disease. So, when a woman would give birth, I mean, it needs to be a hygienic and sterile environment, and that was definitely not the case. And you had people, not even doctors, helping give birth. They were called midwives. We'll get into that. But, I mean, even if it was a doctor, the doctors didn't know much more than the midwives. So there was always a chance that child would die almost immediately or within the first year of life. And even if they made it to that first year of life, I mean, there's still chances that they could get, sick and die from whatever. And if there's a famine, right, even if the child doesn't starve to death, they're in a weakened state, so they're in a more susceptible, they have more of a chance of developing some terrible, dreaded disease. What was the biggest killer at this time period in the 18th century? Okay, the bubonic plague is gone. 1720 is the last time it shows up. Like there's a major outbreak. All right, now it was in Marseille, France. But so for the rest of the century, what was the biggest killer? That's right. Good job, Gabby. Glad to see that you're doing better at answering those questions. Doing a great job now. All right. Yep, that's right. So we got the smallpox, and that was a big killer up until the end of, and we're going to kind of mention that a little bit later. Well, I'm sorry, Gabby. I'm not teasing you. I'm proud of you. Dad. I'm not making fun of you. All right, come on. You don't have to get upset with me. All right, but we want to talk about the problem with breastfeeding. They didn't like to breastfeed their children. All right. The poor people did. They were okay with that. But if the woman worked for a living, she can't breastfeed her child. So, and if they were wealthy, like if you were considered like nobility or part of the aristocracy, and even certain members of the middle class, they considered that vulgar. Yeah, breastfeeding your child was considered vulgar, uncivilized. I'm a lady. I wouldn't do that. So, well, what do? Well, they would feed them other things like bread. They make some kind of wet the bread and make like a little soup and grind, mix it all up. They give it cow's milk or goat's milk. But the big thing that they would do is they would send the child out to a wet nurse. Okay, and so that was a woman who had a child. All right, so Mother Nature takes over, and it's called lactation. All right, so you have the child, and it's nature's way. You're supposed to breastfeed your child, and okay, and as long as that child is, taken to, doing that, you're going to continue to lactate. All right, and so as a woman, you could, once your child is old enough that he can start eating regular semi-solid food or whatnot, you can hurry up and offer up your services to somebody and take another newborn and breastfeed that child for some other family. And that's what a lot of the nobles did. All right, and they'd hire a wet nurse. She'd come live with them, and she'd stay for a couple years, and then she'd go off to another family. And so she would, for her whole adult life, she would be lactating and being a wet nurse from one family to the next. But this is what the poor families would do, and this is not, they couldn't afford to have a woman come live with her, so they would just pay, I guess, for the wet nurse to come and, once a day or whatever, let the child suckle, and then she'd go off to another. Well, you can't divide that up a bunch of times, and you can't have a bunch of children doing that because they're not going to get the kind of nutrients that they need. All right. And so a lot of these children were malnourished. And so that they didn't develop right and they were weak. And so it was quite common for them to succumb to disease. Right. Wet nurses. All right. So that's kind of crazy. I mean, it was necessary, I guess, in some instances. But the fact that the rich people didn't want to do that, I think that is that's a vanity. They don't want to do that. Strange. All right. Yeah. So by the end of the century, we start to see some of these Enlightenment thinkers start, and they're all men, telling these women that what they should do is, breastfeed their children. All right. Okay. So here's another challenge that these children had to deal with. This is not a good time to be a child, the 18th century, I'll tell you that. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back to that young lady who, unfortunately, she was a domestic servant, and she got made pregnant, got pregnant from, the family, the father, and she gets fired, and, she can't afford to take care of her child, so what does she do? What does she do? It's not good. All right, it's not good. Either option, you got foundlings and infanticide. Neither one of them is good. All right, you might think one's better than the other, but once we look at it, you're going to say they're both pretty terrible. All right, so infanticide has to do with killing your child after it's born, because they don't have abortion. So yeah, I don't want to talk about that. But infanticide was something that they would do. So they would maybe smother the child, and they accidentally smothered is what they would say. They smothered the child, but because it was common for people to sleep with the child, because if she has to, to breastfeed the child, it's much easier to do it with the baby in the bed, and mom, and there's instances where that's legitimate and that's an accident. It's a terrible thing, and it's not. She probably shouldn't be doing that in the first place, but it's not like she intentionally did it. But anyway, that's what people would say, so that they wouldn't get in trouble. And so some countries started passing laws saying if you're sleeping in the same bed with your infant, and that's wrong, because that could happen. And they were trying to cut down on that infanticide, but it was pretty commonplace. So that's terrible. But the other thing. Is if they had an unwanted child, they think, okay, well, kind of putting them up for adoption in a way, we're going to take them down to a foundling hospital, or it's basically an orphanage, all right? And some charitable organization would be responsible then. But the problem was there was all kinds of children, and it was overcrowded, and they didn't have enough people, and they were usually nuns, and so they're not able to breastfeed the child, because they're not supposed to be doing that. So they'd have to put the kid out to a wet nurse, and they got all these kids, and I'll go on a wet nurse, and forgot that one today, he didn't get fed. So next thing you know, they start dying, and there's all kinds of terrible neglect, and they didn't understand children, and the children sometimes don't mind what they don't listen, and so they're whacking at kids and beating them, and the kids are miserable because they don't have any mommy or daddy that loves them, and so it's just a terrible situation, and oftentimes those kids would die. Yeah, and down here at the bottom of the screen, I'm not even going to say it, because it's just terrible what they found in these storm drains. Yep, terrible stuff. Make me sick to my stomach. All right, so here's this distressed mother setting her child here at the foundling, and she got him in a little basket, wrapped up in a nice little blanket, and probably a little note in there too. But yep, so the foundlings did that, but about 50% died within a year, and if they didn't get adopted, and most of them didn't, you might find a rare instance where a couple would come in and they can't, they're a loving couple and they just can't. It's not in the cards for them to have children, so they might adopt one, but that's few and far between. So most of them, that was going to be their life. And if they stayed there for too long, the chances are they died of neglect as well. So it just was not a good situation at all. All right, so this gets us really to our point about attitudes towards children. All right, and when we look at it's kind of confusing because there's all kinds of statements in these notes here that kind of like contradict each other. All right, so basically, this is my role. I'm the teacher. I can cut through all the confusion, and I can cast, illuminate the situation so everybody can understand it just so perfectly. All right. So what they would do, all right, in the beginning of the 18th century, the view, because the situation was children died frequently, that parents, as kind of a mechanism, self-preservation mechanism, would kick in because they knew the reality was there's a chance that my baby might die. So to prevent any kind of personal anguish, they would naturally just remain detached from the child, and that's not what a child needs. You gotta love on them babies, and you gotta kiss them and hug them and hold them, and that's as important as food and sleep and warmth. They need to be loved. All right, they just soak it up like a sponge. It really bothers me because there's a problem today. Well, the problem been ever since the beginning of time, but too many parents treat their children like house plants. Put some water, put them out in front of the TV or out in the sun, and they'll be fine. No, you got to interact with them kids. You got to talk to them. Like I said, you got to love on them, and sometimes you got to give them some discipline. We'll talk about that in just a second. Anyway, so yep. So in the first half of the 18th century, that was kind of the relationship, okay? Distant or aloof, okay? Because parents didn't want to have to deal with all of the pain and anguish associated with that. All right, and so here's the other thing. Here's the other part of it. They didn't really understand that childhood was a distinct phase of development. All right, so now there's all these sociologists out there, and they can identify all these different phases of life, okay, and that they are all distinct from one another. And basically, the common view back then was if you were a child, like a toddler, and not an infant, but like a toddler, small child, you were just basically a miniature adult, okay? And you can see it by the pictures too, or paintings. They dressed them like in just small adult clothes. They looked like little adults, all right? And that was, reflective of the way they treated them. And because of lots of history, the way that they view, because like I said, children don't always do what they're told. Well, adults don't either, but especially kids. You say sit down, they don't sit down. You say be quiet, they start shouting, and parents, they get frustrated. Okay, and nobody really was there saying, hey, don't beat your kids. In fact, they were telling them just the opposite. And like if you look at scriptures, or at least the interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve, Eve, the temptress, she's the one responsible for man's fall from grace. And so all throughout history, they treat women as kind of evil. Like today we look at women and we kind of hold them up as the more moral, right, of the two genders, right? But not back then. The woman was evil, and that she was weak, and she would give in to the temptation of the devil, and then she would try to get her husband to do naughty things. And that kind of coincides with the story of Adam and Eve and how they get cast out of the Garden of Eden. And so that stain that, of them getting kicked out gets passed on to all future generations. So every child is born sinful. And so you got to, as a parent, you got to whoop them. You got to whoop them so hard that evil and that wickedness is gone. Like they're possessed with a demon, and you got to just beat that demon out of your child. And that's how they treat them. And I got this picture up here too, because I went to a Catholic school, and we had nuns, and they was always grabbing us and swatting us and hitting rulers. And I had one teacher, she had a big old paddle, right? Big old paddle, and it had holes in it, like so that when she'd whoop you, like the air would pass through the holes and it wouldn't slow her down, so she could really hit you hard. And then I had another teacher had one, you know what? And they like had an engraving on it, like wood. They burn the wood. I don't know what that's called, but they like can make artistic things by burning things into the wood. Anyway, you know what she had on it? It said, "Ouch." Ouch. You darn right. You get hit with one of those big paddles, can't sit for a week. I'll tell you what. But that, you know what they'd say? You spare the rod, you spoil the child. That's right. Hey, oh, look at this. This is interesting. Painting here. Hey, look at that. Look at that. She's got no teeth. Look at the big chin there. That's the not the midwife. That's the wet nurse. All right, so that's mom and papa and their other babies. And it's this little newborn. And look at him. Look at the daddy. He's grabbing on to his wife. He's kneeling down close to the crib, holding on to his wife in a very loving embrace. And the way he's looking at the child is he's got love in his eyes. So that certainly kind of counters the perception that we have that the babies weren't loved. Okay, so there is evidence that goes against it. Oh, look at this one. See this? See this? So this is a wealthy family because you can see they got this big old house, and the way they're dressed, they're pretty fancy, and they got a telescope or whatnot over there in the corner. So they got a lot of consumer items. But so look at the little kids. All right, they dressed up. They got his breeches on just like his daddy. And like I said, he did. Look at this guy right here. Even though they're playing with some toys over here, he and his little sister, they look like little just miniature adults. So and look at the mom. I can't figure out how to zoom in yet. I forgot I was supposed to look that up. But look at her. She don't look too happy, and he don't either. They don't look too like they got 4 beautiful children, and they haven't died. You know, that's the reality. They could have died, but instead of she don't even got her arm around her. Come on, mama, love her. Love your baby. But she doesn't. She's just kind of cold. All right? And the poor kid. What's that? Daddy got a stick? Looks like he's like, give me that stick, son. Give me the rod. I'm going to whoop you in the fanny. I guess. I don't know. But, so this gives you another picture, I guess. Right? Kind of that distant, cold, aloof relationship. So, back to back, you got 2 contradicting. What are we to think? What are we supposed to... How did they love their babies or didn't they? Well, look right here. Starting around 1760, we start to see a different view. Okay, whether that's the Enlightenment or other forces, just natural evolution. You know, that people begin to change. They start to look at things a little bit differently, and but a lot of it has to do with the Enlightenment and education, right? And that there's a better way. That there is a better way. Okay. Now they still would whoop their kids because we see that all through. Up into the 20th century, fierce beatings. You know, your child does something wrong, you beat the tarnation out of them. All right, that really doesn't change. But the way in which, I mean, there are some who are saying that's not a good idea, but it doesn't really catch on. It takes a while. All right, it takes like a couple hundred years before it catches on. But they start changing the way the experts of like how you should raise your child. Like there's more information out there, and it's being dispensed to the young parents, and basically they're telling them, you breastfeed your child, okay? You gotta love your babies, okay? Don't swaddle them, all right? Don't make a little baby burrito out of them because that's not good for them. They need they gotta be clean, they gotta get a lot of rest, and good food, all of this stuff, and that this will help your little baby grow up to be nice and strong. Okay, so that was something that they taught. Oh, and he's the expert, self-described expert. I don't like this story too much, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's kind of one of those Frenchies that's really smart. They're not all that smart, but he is, and it's not like England, right? We talk about England and how something in the water with those people, but about how smart they are. But the Frenchies, they do a few things right. And he was a writer, and he talked about politics and stuff. He was kind of an Enlightenment figure, and we'll talk about him more when we get to an era called the Romantic era. All right, but he wrote this book called Emile, and it's about basically how to raise children. And he's got a lot of interesting insights. And basically, he's the one that comes up with this notion that there are distinct phases of development, and you got to treat your babies like such, and don't expect them, to be able to do all the kind of things that adults do. And they got to protect those children. Okay, you got to protect your child. You got to shield your child. You got to, deal with the monkeys, the hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. This is something, and this bothers me, because, like, I'll go see a movie, on occasion. It might happen to be rated R. It's not like I'm going there to seek out rated R movies. It's a movie I want to see, and oh yeah, it happens to be rated R. But, I think, what was it? I went and saw Zero Dark 30, okay? It was an amazing film. Talked about how these the SEAL Team 6 went out there and they got that Osama bin Laden. They killed that man. And I mean, it was just a really powerful film. There was some man and like a 3-4-year-old child with him. That made me mad. I almost wanted to go up and tell him or ask him what on God's green earth made him think that was a good idea for his child to see that. He don't need to see all that. And that's what parents don't do these days. They don't kind of shield their children. They let it all hang out. Let it all hang out. Yep, watch rated R movies. You're 4 years old. Go ahead. Go watch Chucky and all that nonsense. And then they got nightmares, and then they come to school and they're all mixed up and they're scared all the time. They got phobias. I don't like that. That bothers me. I'm sorry. I'm getting on my soapbox here. But anyway, he was the one that said, protect your children. Education's important. He had a really crazy idea of education. All right, like basically, just let the kid learn on his own through discovery. Okay, trial and error, and eventually, the child, because of his inquisitive, his natural curiosity, will lead him to a good education. That don't always work out that way. All right, discover. I hate to tell you, but that's not exactly how it goes. But it was some, his other ideas about loving the child and nurturing the child. Those are things that were well embraced. And then another enlightened fella who was also very big on. He wrote about the 2 treatises of government. He talked about natural rights and how God-given natural rights, and that the government's responsibility is to protect those natural rights. And if it doesn't, you have a right to overthrow it. Social contract. That's John Locke. He also talked about education as well. That's right. And he said that babies were born like with a blank slate, and he used a Latin term called tabula rasa, which means blank slate. And as such, everything that the child learns, again, through experiences, but it's blank. Right? When the child is born, it doesn't know anything naturally or intuitively. It's what it learns. And so there's another term for this that you learn in like developmental classes or sociology, psychology. It's called nature versus nurture. Like what percentage? And he believed everything was nurture. Everything that you teach that the child learn will have been taught to him. And some people didn't agree with that, because he basically said that the children were inherently good. Okay, and that kind of counters what the Bible says. So there were some people that didn't necessarily agree with John Locke and tabula rasa. All right, so here we got some children's stories, and this guy John Newbery Awards. Those are books that child literature books that are very got good stories and good rich text, and anyway, but we start to see education being more important in children's books and stuff like that. And Mother Goose and Little Miss Muffet sat on it. Yeah, I read all these to my 2 babies. Yep. So that got to read to your children too. That's something else that's important. Remember, they're not house plants. You got to raise your babies and teach them stuff. Yep, that's right. Okay, so big thing about Rousseau though is he's kind of a hypocrite, because he abandoned all his children and sent them to foundling, right? Like 5 babies, and never married his wife either, and abandoned all his children, and all his children died. So much for Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I don't like that guy. All right, so elementary schools start to come on board during the 18th century, and the first country that institutes compulsory education. Compulsory, meaning you were being compelled to go. You have to go for elementary for like ages 6 to 12 was Russia. All right, them German, Prussians, okay, they were the first to embrace that. Now, other countries thought it was important, especially those countries that were Protestant, because if we go back to Protestantism, let's go back to Martin Luther, right? Sola Scriptura, right? Scriptures alone. That's how we, gain salvation. You got to know how to read in order to read the Bible, right? And you got to get an education. So for many Protestants, education was important, and so it was also important for Catholics. But we did talk about the importance, especially with the Protestants. But yeah, here you go, Prussian compulsory education. All right, I gotta hurry up because this is taking too doggone long, and y'all gonna get upset with me. Popular literature. Most people read the Bible. That was the most common book. The more wealthy and the more educated people, they read all sorts of things, including the writings of the Enlightenment figures. But for the common people that didn't know how to read too well, they had, for entertainment value, had these things called chapbooks. They had chapbooks for children too, but they were kind of simple stories, adventurous things, and just to kind of help pass the time. So what we learned then is that there is a way now to communicate to the masses, all right, and there's ways for the masses to get information about society, okay, and that together all the different social classes within a country can effectively be informed about certain things, and they kind of have opinions about the way, the direction the country should be going. We call that public opinion. And because of the advent of more and more people knowing how to read and write, about 50% of the population, towards the end of the century, we start getting up into the 60s and 70s, that it's quite possible to tap into that and find out what exactly the public wants on things like that. So here's some pictures of some chapbooks. Oh yeah, here's something. Here, okay, so this is a way in which, that public opinion is formed. Now this is an American example, but it is a very, applicable to what we're talking about in Europe. But Thomas Paine was one of the, he's considered a founding father, but he was instrumental in the War of Independence, right? And he helped convince a lot of Americans who were on the fence about breaking away from England. So he wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, and in it he makes the case that King George III is a tyrant, and that there is no other recourse but for the Americans to break away from evil old England, right? So anyway, that's it. Hey, I'm going to stop here. I'll do the rest later on, and you'll get the second half of this, all right? So I'm going to go to bed because it's kind of late. All right, good night. I'll talk to y'all later.